The rotor blades thundered overhead as I prepared to drop into what looked like a war zone. Below me, thousands of homes sat in complete darkness during the worst storm our region had seen in decades. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Hospitals were running on backup power. And there, in the middle of it all, stood one woman beside her luxury SUV, still blocking access to the electrical substation that could restore power to the entire area. Her name was Karen Mitchell. She was the HOA president of my neighborhood, and she had just single-handedly caused the largest power outage in our county's history because she did not like my backup generator. As our helicopter descended through the storm, I could see her face in the flashing emergency lights. Even now, even with federal agents surrounding her, she still believed she was in control. That was her biggest mistake. My name is Mike Thompson, and I have been a power lineman for 23 years. I have climbed towers in ice storms, repaired lines during hurricanes, and kept the lights on when everyone else was safe at home. I thought I had seen every kind of emergency until I moved to Meadowbrook Estates. Meadowbrook Estates was the kind of HOA community where they measured your grass with rulers and sent violation notices if your mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Every street looked like it belonged in a magazine. Every house had the same approved color scheme. Every resident lived in fear of Karen Mitchell. Karen was our HOA president, and she treated that title like she was running a small country. She had short blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer clothes for every occasion, and a clipboard that she carried like a weapon. She drove a white BMW SUV with vanity plates that read "Boss Lady," and she made sure everyone knew she was in charge. I had been living in Meadowbrook for 2 years, and Karen had been making my life difficult from day one. She did not like my work truck parked in my driveway. She did not like the ladder rack on top of it. She did not like that I sometimes came home dirty from working on power lines. Most of all, she did not like that I did not bow down to her authority like everyone else in the neighborhood. The trouble started getting serious in early October when I installed a backup generator behind my house. It was a necessary piece of equipment for someone in my line of work. When the power goes out, I need to be ready to respond immediately. Having backup power at home meant I could charge my equipment, power my radio, and stay connected with dispatch during emergencies. Karen spotted the generator during one of her daily neighborhood patrols. She marched over to my house the next morning with her clipboard and her attitude. "That thing is an eyesore," she announced, pointing at my generator with her perfectly manicured finger. "It violates Section 12 of our community standards." I tried to explain why I needed it. I told her about my job, about emergency response, about being prepared for power outages. She cut me off before I could finish. "I do not care what your job is," she said, her voice sharp and cold. "Rules are rules. That generator needs to go." The weather reports that week were getting more and more concerning. A massive storm system was moving up from the Gulf of Mexico. The meteorologists were calling it a once-in-a-decade event. High winds, heavy rain, and the potential for widespread power outages across the entire region. I tried to explain this to Karen. I told her that when the storm hit, people were going to need power. They were going to need someone ready to fix the lines when they came down. They were going to need someone who could respond immediately, and that meant having backup power at home. Karen stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. She had never worked a day in essential services. She had never been responsible for keeping the lights on during an emergency. She had never understood that the modern world runs on electricity, and when it goes out, people die. "You can make all the excuses you want," she said, turning to walk away. But that generator is coming down, or you are going to face the consequences. As she walked back to her house, I looked up at the darkening sky. The storm was coming, whether Karen understood it or not. And when it hit, her little power games were going to collide with the real world in ways she could never imagine. I had no idea just how right I was. 3 days later, Karen showed up at my front door with a manila envelope and a smile that made my blood run cold. She was dressed in a navy blue business suit, her hair perfectly styled, and her clipboard tucked under her arm like she was heading to a board meeting. "Good morning, Mike," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I have some official HOA business to discuss with you." She handed me the envelope with a flourish, clearly proud of whatever was inside. I opened it and found a formal cease and desist letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, and signed by Karen and 2 other board members. The letter was 3 pages long and full of legal-sounding language that probably came straight from the internet. It demanded that I remove my unauthorized generator installation within 24 hours or face fines of $500 per day, plus legal action to place a lien on my property. "You cannot be serious," I said, looking up from the letter. "I am completely serious," Karen replied, her smile growing wider. "You have had plenty of time to comply voluntarily. Now you are going to comply whether you want to or not." I took a deep breath and tried one more time to reason with her. The weather forecast had gotten even worse overnight. The storm was now expected to bring winds of up to 80 miles per hour, with the potential for tornadoes and widespread power outages lasting several days. "Karen, listen to me," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "This storm is going to be bad, really bad. When the power goes out, and it will go out, I need to be ready to respond. That generator is not just for me. It is for everyone in this community who is going to need their power restored as quickly as possible." Corinne laughed, actually laughed at my explanation. "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You are just some blue-collar worker who thinks he knows better than the rest of us. I have a business degree. I have been running this HOA for 5 years. I think I know a little more about property management than you do." The condescension in her voice made my jaw clench. Here was a woman who had never climbed a power pole, never worked in a storm, never been responsible for anything more dangerous than a homeowners meeting, and she was dismissing decades of experience like it meant nothing. "This is not about property management," I said. "This is about emergency preparedness. When people lose power during a storm like this, it can be a matter of life and death." "Do not be so dramatic," Karen said, rolling her eyes. "It is just a little storm. People will be fine for a few hours without power." That was when I realized she truly did not understand. She lived in a bubble where power outages were minor inconveniences, not life-threatening emergencies. She had never seen what happens when hospitals lose power, when elderly people cannot run their medical equipment, when traffic lights go dark during a storm. Karen was not finished with her performance. She pulled out her phone and started making calls right there on my doorstep. First, she called Margaret from 3 houses down, then Bob from across the street, then several other neighbors I barely knew. "I am organizing a petition," she announced between calls. "Everyone agrees that your generator is unsightly and inappropriate for our community. By tomorrow morning, I will have signatures from every homeowner on this street demanding its removal." I watched her work the phones, painting me as some kind of neighborhood troublemaker who did not care about property values. She was good at it, I had to admit. She knew exactly how to frame the argument to get people on her side. Within an hour, she had a small crowd of neighbors gathered on my front lawn. They nodded along as Karen explained how my generator was bringing down everyone's property values and violating the community standards they had all agreed to follow. "We all have to follow the rules," one of them said. "No exceptions." I tried one last time to explain the situation. I told them about the approaching storm, about the likelihood of extended power outages, about the importance of emergency preparedness. But Karen had already poisoned the well. They saw me as the problem, not the solution. As the crowd dispersed, Karen stayed behind for one final word. 24 hours, she said, holding up one finger. "After that, things get expensive for you." The weather alert on my phone buzzed with an update. The storm had strengthened. It was now expected to make landfall in less than 18 hours. Karen disappeared for 2 days after delivering her ultimatum, and I should have known she was up to something. When she got quiet, it usually meant she was plotting something bigger than her usual petty violations and fine threats. I found out what she had been doing when my supervisor called me at 6 in the morning on Friday. "Mike, we have got a problem," Dave said, his voice tense. "Some HOA lady is claiming she owns part of the Meadowbrook Substation property. She is demanding we shut down all operations immediately." My heart sank. I knew exactly who he was talking about. "Let me guess," I said. "Blonde hair, drives a white BMW, thinks she runs the world." "That is the one," Dave confirmed. "She showed up at the district office yesterday with a stack of property records and some old easement documents. She is claiming the HOA has legal rights to the land where the substation sits." The Meadowbrook substation was the primary power distribution point for our entire area. It fed electricity to over 15,000 homes and businesses, including 2 schools, a nursing home, and a medical clinic. If something happened to that substation during the storm, the whole region would go dark. Karen had spent her 2 days of silence digging through property records and legal documents, looking for any technicality she could use as leverage. She had found an old easement agreement from the 1970s that mentioned HOA oversight of common areas, and she was trying to use it to claim authority over critical infrastructure. "Dave, she does not have any real legal standing here," I said. "That easement is about landscaping and maintenance, not electrical equipment." "I know that, and you know that," Dave replied. "But she is threatening to file an injunction if we do not comply with her demands. She says she will call the media and make this a big public relations nightmare." The storm was now less than 12 hours away. The Weather Service had issued a hurricane warning for our area. Emergency management officials were telling people to prepare for extended power outages and possible evacuations. And Karen was playing legal games with the infrastructure that kept our community running. By 10 o'clock that morning, Karen had escalated beyond phone calls and paperwork. She drove her BMW directly to the substation and parked it across the access road, blocking the entrance completely. I got there just in time to see her setting up folding chairs and a small canopy, like she was planning to stay for a while. She had recruited 3 other HOA board members to join her little protest, and they were holding signs that read HOA property rights and Stop Illegal Construction. A utility supervisor named Rick was already on scene, trying to reason with her. Rick was a patient man who had been dealing with difficult customers for 20 years, but even he looked frustrated. "Ma'am, you need to understand," Rick was saying, his voice strained but professional. "This is critical infrastructure. We have a major storm approaching, and we need access to this equipment to keep the power on for the entire area." Karen sat in her folding chair like a queen on her throne, completely unmoved by his explanation. "I understand perfectly," she said, not even looking up from her clipboard. "What you need to understand is that this is HOA property, and you do not have permission to be here. If you want access, you need to go through the proper channels and submit a formal request." "Ma'am, there is no time for that," Rick said, gesturing toward the darkening sky. "The storm is going to hit tonight. If we cannot maintain this equipment, thousands of people are going to lose power." Karen finally looked up from her clipboard, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. She was enjoying this. She was actually enjoying the power she thought she had over the situation. "That is not my problem," she said with a shrug. "Maybe next time you will follow proper procedures." Rick tried for another hour to reason with her, explaining the legal requirements for electrical infrastructure, the emergency protocols that superseded local regulations, and the potential consequences of her actions. Karen ignored every word. By noon, the first transformer had blown on the other side of town. A tree branch, blown by the increasing winds, had taken out a power line and left 200 homes without electricity. It was just the beginning. I stood at the edge of the substation property, watching Karen and her supporters celebrating what they thought was a victory over the utility company. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The storm was coming, and they had just made sure we would not be ready for it. The storm hit at 3:30 in the afternoon with a fury that caught everyone off guard. The weather service had predicted high winds and heavy rain, but what we got was closer to a hurricane. Trees that had stood for decades were ripped from the ground. Power lines snapped like guitar strings. And throughout it all, Karen sat in her folding chair, still blocking access to the substation. The first major outage happened at 4:15, when a massive oak tree crashed into the main transmission line feeding the eastern part of our district. That single tree took out power to over 3,000 homes, including the regional hospital and 2 nursing homes. My phone started ringing immediately. Emergency dispatch was calling every available lineman to report for duty. The National Weather Service was upgrading their warnings. Emergency management was opening shelters. And I was sitting in my house, watching my neighbors lose power one by one, while Karen kept our repair crews locked out of the most critical piece of equipment in the area. I suited up in my storm gear and headed for my truck. Through the rain and wind, I could see Karen's white BMW still parked across the substation entrance. She had moved inside her car when the weather got bad, but she was still there, still blocking access, still convinced she was fighting the good fight. By 5 o'clock, the situation had become catastrophic. The hospital was running on backup generators, but those were only designed to last 6 hours. The nursing home on Elm Street had lost power completely when their backup system failed. Emergency services were struggling to respond to calls because half the traffic lights in the city were dark. My dispatcher called with an update that made my heart sink. "Mike, we have got a problem," she said, her voice tight with stress. "The Meadowbrook substation is the key to restoring power to the whole region, but that crazy lady is still blocking access. The sheriff tried to move her, but she is claiming property rights and threatening to sue everyone." I looked out my window at Karen's car, barely visible through the storm. Her little protest had evolved into something much more serious. She was no longer just violating HOA rules or playing neighborhood politics. She was actively preventing emergency repairs during a disaster that was putting lives at risk. The call that changed everything came at 6:30. A transformer explosion on the north side of town had knocked out power to the water treatment plant. Without electricity, The pumps that supplied drinking water to 40,000 people had stopped working. The backup generators at the plant would keep things running for maybe 12 hours, but after that, the entire city would be without water. That was when my phone rang with the call I had been expecting and dreading. "Mike, this is Chief Dispatcher Williams," the voice on the other end said. "We need you to suit up for an emergency helicopter operation. You are our most experienced lineman in that area, and we need someone who can get that substation back online fast." "What about the blockade?" I asked. "Let us worry about that," Williams said. "You just worry about getting the power back on. We are declaring a federal emergency. This is no longer a local matter." I hung up the phone and looked out at the storm. The wind was howling now, bending trees almost horizontal. Rain was coming down in sheets. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Karen was still sitting in her car, still believing she was in control of the situation. Through my window, I could see lights flickering on and off throughout the neighborhood as people tried to use candles and flashlights. Mrs. Peterson from next door was outside with a flashlight, trying to clear debris from her driveway. The Martinez family across the street had gathered on their front porch, looking lost and confused without power. These were the people Karen claimed to represent. These were the homeowners whose property values she said she was protecting. And now they were sitting in the dark, vulnerable and scared, because their HOA president had decided to play games with critical infrastructure during the worst storm in a decade. My equipment bag was already packed and ready to go. My safety gear was laid out and inspected. All I had to do was wait for the call telling me where to meet the helicopter. As I waited, I watched Karen's BMW through the rain. Every few minutes, I could see her silhouette in the driver's seat, still holding her clipboard, still convinced she was fighting for something important. She had no idea that her little power trip was about to collide with the full force of federal emergency response. She had no idea that blocking critical infrastructure during a declared emergency was a federal crime. She had no idea that her actions had just escalated from petty neighborhood politics to potential domestic terrorism charges. Most of all, she had no idea that in less than an hour, I would be dropping out of the sky in a helicopter, ready to fix the mess she had created. The call came at 7:45, just as the storm was reaching its peak intensity. Chief Dispatcher Williams was back on the line, but this time his voice carried the weight of a full emergency response. "Mike, we have clearance for the helicopter operation," he said. "Federal Emergency Management has taken control of the situation. You are flying out of Regional Airport in 15 minutes. This is now a national emergency response." I grabbed my gear and headed for the door, but before I left, I took one last look at Karen's BMW through the storm. She was still there, still blocking the entrance, apparently oblivious to the fact that her little protest had just triggered a federal response that would make her neighborhood drama look like a children's game. The ride to the airport was surreal. Emergency vehicles were everywhere, their lights cutting through the darkness and rain. Power lines were down across half the roads in the city. Traffic lights were dark at every intersection. The storm had turned our modern city into something from a disaster movie, and it was all because one woman refused to let qualified people do their jobs. The helicopter was a massive utility aircraft, designed specifically for emergency power line work. It carried specialized equipment, backup generators, and enough supplies to restore power to thousands of homes. As I climbed aboard, the pilot briefed me on the situation. "We have got federal agents coordinating with local police," he shouted over the rotor noise. "They are going to clear the landing zone, But that lady is still refusing to move her vehicle. She keeps claiming she has legal authority to block access. I strapped myself in and checked my equipment one more time. Everything I needed to restore power to the entire region was packed into the cargo hold behind me. All we had to do was get to the substation, and I could have the lights back on within hours. As we lifted off into the storm, I could see the full scope of the disaster from above. Entire neighborhoods were dark. Emergency vehicles were scattered across the city like toys. The hospital was lit up like a beacon, running on backup power that would not last much longer. And there, in the middle of it all, was the Meadowbrook substation with Karen's white BMW still parked across the entrance. "There she is," the pilot said, pointing down at the car. "Federal agents have been trying to move her for the last hour, but she keeps refusing to budge. She says she is going to sue everyone for violating her property rights." From the air, Karen's protest looked pathetic and absurd. Here was a woman sitting in her luxury car, blocking access to critical infrastructure during a regional emergency, while thousands of people sat in the dark and federal agents coordinated the largest emergency response in our area's history. As we circled the substation, I could see police cars, federal agent vehicles, and emergency response trucks surrounding the area. Floodlights had been set up to illuminate the scene. News helicopters were circling at a distance, filming what would become the lead story on every channel in the state. "We need a landing zone," the pilot said. "The only clear area is the HOA common space right next to the substation." I looked down at Meadowbrook's perfectly manicured common area, the same space that Karen had used as a symbol of her authority and control. The same space where she held her monthly meetings and her annual community barbecues. The same space where she had spent years enforcing her vision of suburban perfection. "Do it," I said. The descent was rough due to the storm, but our pilot was experienced with emergency landings. As we approached the common area, I could see Karen's face through her car window. For the first time since this whole thing started, she looked scared. The moment our helicopter touched down was cinematically perfect. The rotor wash sent debris flying in every direction. Karen's perfectly maintained flower beds were destroyed in seconds. The decorative bushes she had spent thousands of HOA dollars on were flattened. The elegant lamp posts that lined the walking paths were bent and broken. As I stepped out of the helicopter in my full safety gear, I felt like I was stepping into a movie. Emergency lights were flashing everywhere. Federal agents were directing traffic. News cameras were rolling. And there, in the middle of it all, was Karen Mitchell, still sitting in her car, still clutching her clipboard, still believing she was in control. I walked toward the substation, my equipment bag slung over my shoulder, ready to restore power to thousands of homes. Karen's car was directly in my path, but it would not be there much longer. Federal agents approached her vehicle from both sides. Through the rain and wind, I could hear them giving her final warnings to move her car or face arrest for obstruction of emergency services. Karen rolled down her window, just enough to shout back at them. "I am the HOA president," she screamed. "This is my property. You cannot do this to me." That was when I realized she still did not understand. Even now, even with federal agents surrounding her car and a helicopter full of emergency equipment landing in her neighborhood, she still thought her HOA presidency meant something in the face of a federal emergency response. She was about to learn how wrong she was. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Federal agents moved in on Karen's vehicle from 3 directions, while local police secured the perimeter. Emergency response teams stood ready to begin repairs the moment the obstruction was cleared. I watched from beside the helicopter as Karen made her last stand. She had rolled up her windows and locked her doors, apparently believing that her BMW could serve as some kind of fortress against federal law enforcement. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see her frantically dialing her phone, probably calling her lawyer or her husband or anyone she thought could save her from the consequences of her actions. The lead federal agent approached her driver's side window with a megaphone. His voice cut through the storm with crystal clarity. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. You are currently obstructing emergency services during a declared federal disaster. If you do not move your vehicle immediately, you will be arrested and your car will be towed. You have 60 seconds to comply." Karen cracked her window just enough to shout a response that would be played on news channels for weeks to come. "I am the HOA president of this community," she screamed. "You have no authority here. This is private property, and I am protecting it from your illegal activities." The federal agent looked at his watch, counted down the remaining seconds, then signaled to his team. Within minutes, they had broken Karen's window, unlocked her car, and pulled her out into the storm. She was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police cruiser before she could even process what was happening to her. Her BMW was towed away so fast it seemed to disappear into thin air. The entrance to the substation was finally clear, and I could get to work. As I approached the electrical equipment, I could hear Karen shouting from the police car about lawsuits and property rights, and how everyone was going to pay for this violation of her authority. Her voice was barely audible over the storm, but her words carried across the scene like the ravings of someone completely detached from reality. The substation repairs took me 3 hours of intense work in dangerous conditions. Rain was pouring down, winds were still gusting over 60 miles per hour, and I was working with live electrical equipment that could kill me if I made a single mistake. But this was what I had trained for. This was why I had spent 23 years learning every aspect of power distribution and emergency repair. While I worked, the full scope of Karen's legal problems was becoming clear. Federal agents were documenting everything, taking photographs, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that would follow her for the rest of her life. Obstructing emergency services during a federal disaster carried serious criminal penalties. Interfering with critical infrastructure could be prosecuted as domestic terrorism. The lawsuits from affected businesses and residents would likely bankrupt her family. The media attention was unlike anything our quiet community had ever seen. News trucks lined the streets around Meadowbrook. Reporters were interviewing neighbors, emergency responders, and anyone who had witnessed Karen's spectacular fall from power. The story was already spreading across social media with hashtags like HOA Karen and helicopter justice. By midnight, I had the main substation back online. The first neighborhoods to get power back were the hospital and the nursing homes, followed by emergency services and critical infrastructure. As each section of the grid came back online, I could see lights flickering on across the city like stars appearing in the night sky. Karen spent the night in a holding cell, still demanding to speak with her lawyer and still insisting that everyone else was wrong. Her husband showed up at the police station around 2 in the morning, but instead of bailing her out, he served her with divorce papers. Her own family could not tolerate the embarrassment and legal liability she had brought down on them. The HOA board members who had supported Karen's protest had scattered the moment federal agents arrived. They suddenly could not remember why they had thought blocking emergency services was a good idea. Their signatures were still on the petition supporting Karen's actions, but their memories had become conveniently selective. As dawn broke over our storm-damaged community, the full extent of Karen's destruction was visible. The helicopter landing had destroyed the common area she had spent years perfecting. Her actions had caused millions of dollars in storm damage that could have been prevented with proper emergency response. Her legal fees would consume her family's savings for decades to come. But the lights were back on. The hospital was running normally. The nursing homes had power for their life support equipment. The water treatment plant was operational. Emergency services could respond to calls. The traffic lights were working again. I had done my job, just like I always did. I had kept the lights on when people needed them most. The only difference was that this time, I had to overcome an obstacle that no lineman should ever have to face. A neighbor so consumed with petty power that she was willing to endanger thousands of lives to prove a point. Karen Mitchell had learned the hard way that real authority comes from expertise, experience, and the willingness to serve others. Her version of authority, based on bylaws and personal ego, had crumbled the moment it encountered real-world consequences. The community would rebuild from the storm damage. The power grid would be stronger than ever. But Karen's reputation, her marriage, her finances, and her sense of control were destroyed beyond repair. Justice had been served with the efficiency of a well-maintained electrical grid. 6 months later, I was standing in the same spot where Karen's BMW had blocked the substation entrance, but everything had changed. The access road was wider now, with clear signage marking it as critical infrastructure. The HOA common area had been rebuilt with emergency landing zones and utility access points. Most importantly, there was a new bronze plaque near the entrance that read, "Emergency Services Access Obstruction Prohibited by Federal Law." The transformation of Meadowbrook Estates had been remarkable. The storm damage had been repaired within weeks, but the changes to our community went much deeper than new roofs and replanted trees. The residents had voted Karen out of office while she was still in jail, and they had asked me to serve as the new HOA safety coordinator. My first official act was to completely rewrite the community bylaws. Gone were the petty restrictions on work trucks and utility equipment. In their place were comprehensive emergency preparedness guidelines that encouraged residents to maintain backup power, emergency supplies, and communication equipment. The new HOA board included a retired firefighter, a nurse, and a meteorologist. We focused on safety and preparedness instead of property values and aesthetic violations. Karen's legal troubles had mounted like a storm system that never moved away. Federal charges for obstructing emergency services had resulted in 18 months in prison and a $100,000 fine. Civil lawsuits from affected businesses, the hospital, and individual residents had bankrupted her family completely. The nursing home had sued her for endangering their residents. The hospital had sued